This is Darren with Chenard's Nursery. I'd like to talk to you today about maintaining and improving your soil using cover crops. So cover crops are crops that are intentionally planted for soil maintenance and improvement rather than for harvest. And they do a number of good functions in the garden. Cover crops improve soil texture by providing organic mass into the soil. Cover crops improve soil nutrition, soil nutrient values. Some cover crops scavenge nutrients from the soil, trap them into the biological mass so they can be released as the crops decay in the ground after they're tilled in. Others are nitrogen fixers that actually take nitrogen out of the air, transfer it to their root zone where it can be incorporated into the soil later in the year. Cover crops reduce soil erosion and compaction, especially over the winter, where our rainfall in Western Oregon is pretty notable for the amount of erosion and compaction problems it creates. Cover crops go a long way to ameliorating that condition. One of the big uses of cover crops is weed suppression, growing plants that have desirable characteristics versus undesirable characteristics as a huge benefit for the dormant or fallow season. Some cover crops can also reduce certain insect and disease problems and thus reduce the need for spraying or reduce crop failures the following year. So cover crops break into three main groups. Legumes are primarily grown for soil nutrient improvement. They have a lot of large biological mass, and these are the plants that typically fix nitrogen from the air and add them to the soil. Grains are great competition crops. They do the best job of deterring insects and weeds. They provide also a large amount of biomass, and some of them have very deep root systems that help scavenge nutrients, particularly phosphorus, from deep in the soil. Other cover crops is a catch-all for some miscellaneous crops that are usable in conjunction with these crops or for special uses like soil fumigation or deep soil breaking. Legume crops improve soil nitrogen as well as soil texture. Common cover crops in the legume family include, of course, the classic clovers, all forms of clover, vetch, Austrian field pea, and fava beans. Different cover crops in this family have slightly different soil needs, so it's important to evaluate your soil and get good recommendations from your vendor when you are ready to purchase cover crops. Grains provide biomass and weed and pest deterrents. Where legumes are often slow to get started in the fall, the grains jump up right away, stopping a lot of those fall germinating weeds from getting established. Typical grain cover crops include wheat, rye grain, ryegrass, and oats, although others are sometimes used as well. The large root masses of the grains provide a really great deterrence from many soil insects like garden symphyllum. Other cover crops include daikon radish. Daikon radish has a very deep taproot, which is excellent at breaking up heavy clay soils. Various types of mustard, including edible mustards like arugula and corn salad. These are one of the few cover crops that you can actually harvest as well as use as a cover crop. The greens are harvestable over the winter, and then the cover crop is incorporated in the spring. Mustards provide a really good disease and pest deterrence on the shallow end of the soil level. So when they're incorporated into the soil, they actually deter other soil organisms. Buckwheat is a kind of a special case. It's not used as a winter cover crop. Buckwheat is used as a summer cover crop in areas that you are fallowing for a season to dramatically improve both the soil biological content and also your soil nitrogen availability. To use cover crops effectively, here's a few tips and tricks that'll make your fall go better. Use a mix of cover crop types rather than a single cover crop. If you blend your cover crops, you can gain the benefits of all the different classes. Common cover crop blends include clover and wheat or vetch and rye grain. And mixing those crops together are a very, very good approach to cover cropping. Plant early. The earlier you get your cover crops in, the more mass they get, the more advantage they will gain in your garden. Early means summer. However, of course, you still have a lot of crops in the garden over the summer. So as spaces open up, as crops finish out, as we get into August or so, go ahead and put your cover crops in if you're not using that space for fall and winter gardening. It's also okay for your really late crops, like those tomatoes that are holding on into the end of September and trying to get those last few tomatoes to ripen out. to go ahead and sow your cover crops right underneath the standing tomatoes so that they can germinate and get started while the tomatoes are still in the ground. Yes, you will lose a little bit when you pull those plants at the end of the season, but you can always fill in those little gaps later. The best way to do cover crops on a small scale like the home garden is simply to hand scatter. There's not much to be gained about getting a specialty spreader for spreading them around. We generally recommend that if you're doing a mix of cover crops, because of the differences in seed size, that you sow each type of cover crop separately. So you go through and sow all your wheat, and then you go through and sow all your clover behind it. Otherwise you get kind of an uneven distribution in the mix of cover crops. When the season is over, most cover crops need to be cut and let lay. You can do this with a lawnmower or a scythe or pruners, depending on the scale and level that you want to get involved, and then till them into the soil to maximize their benefit. Because no-till gardening is an increasingly popular way of conserving soil biology and structure, it's important to note that some cover crops do not have to be worked in. Classic examples of this are vetch and daikon radish. These are crops that you can simply hoe the crowns out and let them lay and plant through the crop debris, and you do not need to incorporate them into the garden. So I hope you take advantage of the opportunity to use your fallow winter season for improving your soil rather than letting the rain and weeds take it over, and try some cover cropping this season. Thank you.